Our instructors working with small groups of students, looking at digital simulations and trying to understand how do we work with these and how do they work with them on their own when I'm not there in the room. Some people have an image of analytics as sort of a technology that is going to overwhelm us and sort of lock us in cages of our own design, whether those are of robots or all the way down to very young children. But what I want to share with you today is a very different vision of analytics. Analytics vision that's profoundly human, profoundly interactive, and profoundly empowering. So whether it's talking about what's going on social media with a bunch of our students, or whether it's helping someone who just got a new position as a TA to work on her body language. This is a set of analytics that helps you see whether you sort of have open, welcoming, or closed body posture, and a whole bunch of other things to help with presentation skills. All of these are different ways where the analytics become tools to help us do what we've been trying to do all along better, which is teach and learn well. So not thinking of analytics as coming to sort of rule upon us, but as tools that we can leverage to help us in our job. So when people talk about learning analytics, they usually think about the data and the analytics constructed for them. But this is sort of the bottom half of the iceberg in some sense. This is the part the machines do. There's a whole lot of things that happen with humans, both before and after that piece. So first thing to think about is obviously before the data is generated, learners have to do something. And we need to really be thinking carefully about what's going on in those activities and how things we do in the real world get translated into data traces. And equally importantly, the things that students do don't just happen in a vacuum or naturally in some sense. They happen as a result, hopefully, of the experiences that we set up for them as instructors or instructional designers. When we have the analytics constructed, just because we have information doesn't necessarily mean we know what to do with it. So there's this very important role of, okay, this is what the data says, but what does that mean in the context of the experience I designed, and how does it feed back as part of a cycle into changing a course experience, or maybe trying to help learners engage in a different way. So what we're going to do in this talk is I'm going to just try and sort of walk through some of the different parts of this cycle and show you some of the ways that we've been doing this at NYU in the hopes that this will give you some points of inspiration to maybe think about how it'll be useful for you in your own work at Minnesota or beyond. So just to have a definition at the start, learning analytics is the use of data science methods to generate insights into teaching and learning that lead to direct, impactful action. Certainly, educational research has used data for a very long time, but what's special and different about learning analytics is that hopefully it's starting to generate information in the moment that we can use to change what we're doing while we're still doing it, as opposed to months or weeks or years later. All sorts of different insights are possible. For designers, we can see how students use the course activities we design. For instructors, we can see where students do and don't understand what's going on and where more support is needed. For students, there's a powerful opportunity to become more reflective on how we learn as learners and to do it better. For advisors, we can find insight into which students we need to reach out to. And even at the administrative level, we can look at different questions about how curriculum aligns. The key thing that happens across all of these, and the way we think about it, is that each of these analytics categories supports data-informed decision-making. So there's still a human who needs to figure out what do we do, but we're able to do that in a richer way with the use of data. And this process of taking data-informed decisions, I would argue, becomes even more important than it was before with this shift to digital. And I know the language differs. At New York, we're talking about hybrid and remote teaching, but whatever you call it, there's a lot more happening online and a lot less happening face-to-face. And this means that instructors don't have access to many of the classroom-based cues they usually rely on. In fact, we didn't do it today, but I would love to have some Zoom analytics right now because I'm talking to my computer screen, and all the things that would happen if we're in a face-to-face room, the cues that if people are confused or engaged, how you adjust what you're doing, it's not there naturally. But analytics can help us develop it. And in fact, Zoom analytics is one area in which people are working right now. There's also a challenge in online for students, and this is something we've known about for years, that it requires a lot of self-regulation, a lot of self-discipline, and a lot of students aren't prepared for this, nor were they planning to do this. And they don't have access to their peer models. So in a class, you sometimes get a sense of who's studying when, what people are doing to get ready for assignments or tests. But online, people are often more isolated. So figuring out not only what is the student doing, but giving them information about what others, not individually, of course, in group, are doing can be very powerful. And in addition, there's opportunities for access to new information that wasn't available in physical spaces. So for example, we can think about if you're having small group collaboration in Zoom, it's much more easier to track who's talking when, how much different people are talking than it would be in a face-to-face classroom. So as Bogdan mentioned, a lot of my work is in collaboration, and there's new opportunities there. I also wanted to just share what we see as maybe a glimmer of hope in what is a difficult moment. It's a survey of 200 students that we did this spring, right as everything was going online in the middle of the craziness. And not surprisingly, when we talk to students, you know, their experience rating of the course overall, before and after it moved remote, it went down. But what's interesting to note is when we asked them about the previous online courses they had taken, which was, I think, over half of them had taken online courses, they actually rated them quite a bit higher. So I think a lot of the dissatisfaction we saw this spring had to do with the situation as much as the courses. And so, you know, without even improving what online courses did before, and this wasn't just good online courses, this is just online courses overall, we see that there's a chance to improve. And we see that that's something where trying to understand what is and isn't working for students can be very powerful. We also saw something very interesting, which is that the drop in value of course experience was greater for undergrad. And we suspect this has nothing to do with the quality of teaching or courses, but the fact that the undergrad experience has so much more going on than just what you're learning in the class, and it was a lot of the social pieces. So that's, I think, another thing that we're trying to think about how we develop analytics to support information about if students are getting the social experience that they want. And finally, what we see also as a very interesting and positive finding is that we asked students about their feelings about the remote courses at a couple of different points in time, right when everything was happening at first, during the transition period, and then sort of later in the spring when courses were just online, and the ratings went up. And so I think this shows that with adjustment and with time, people can get used to new things, and we can do this well. So I think all of this put together to say that with learning analytics, giving us feedback on a continual basis about what is and isn't working, there's a lot we can do, as many of our courses have at least large online components that's going to be powerful. So let's dive in and take a little bit of a look at what is going on in the first half of the learning analytics cycle. And what I wanted to point out is, you know, we think often of students sort of generating data as they walk around in the world, and really we're usually talking about a digital world, though some analytics do happen in face-to-face spaces, but it's not just coming from the students, it's actually coming from the environment we design. And so if we looked at the traces of where these students chose to walk on this particular campus, it's very strongly shaped by the environment they were placed in. And so there's all sorts of examples of analytics showing, you know, students paid a lot of attention to this activity and not that activity, but it depends when they were given, which order they were given in, what emphasis the instructor placed on them. And so we have to be really careful in imagining that these data traces are sort of these pure, unadulterated truths. Rather, the learning analytics we develop are showing how students respond to the experiences we set up for them. This is another example. This is from a digital textbook. And one of the studies was looking at, let's collect what students decide to highlight. And at first we said, okay, well, if they highlight it, it must be important. But that doesn't tell us very much. So we started thinking about how do you collect richer, smarter data? Well, if students are asked to highlight in different colors, where the colors mean something, suddenly we get much better data. As opposed to saying everything was quote unquote important in some way, now we can see it's important because it was confusing, or it's important because they think they'll be on the test, or it's important because it's school. So these are just examples to sort of generate some thoughts for you about what data may already be generated in the experiences you're giving your students, either face-to-face or online, and ways you might think about tweaking them in just small ways to produce data that's going to allow you to understand quite a bit more about what's going on. So when we think about data, there's certainly data that's been around for a while about who people are and how they've done. But when we think about learning analytics data, there's sort of three kinds we try to look for. And this was Ulrich Hoff, who first called them the 3 A's, which as someone whose name starts with A, I like quite a bit. Activity, things people do. Log files, physical traces, things they tell us. Artifacts, things people create. This might be problem answers, written explanations. This is an area in which we're using a lot of natural language processing. And finally, association, connections people make with other people, with artifacts online, with objects in the real world. The important thing, though, is all of that data is quite low level, and On the face of it, a thing they create or a click they make doesn't have a lot of meaning. It's always a proxy. And so one thing I would encourage you to always think about is, what are you seeing it as a proxy for? Are we seeing attention students give something online as an indication of their effort, or is it an indication they're engaged? Are they interacting? Is it showing that they have knowledge or skills or emotion? There's all these different things, even including values, that we can imbue. So, a lot of times we see someone click on something and say, oh, that means they thought it was important, or were they engaged with it? Those are actually quite different assertions, and so it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about in the world of learning analytics. And I just want to give you one example of what I see as kind of the holy grail, which is to connect these very low-level behaviors, the data we collect, with high-level constructs we care about in education. So one thing that's been around for a while as part of the flipped classroom, and I think we're preparing quite a bit of it for the fall, is pre-class videos. So instead of spending our time that we have synchronously with the students lecturing, we're going to give them videos to watch ahead of time and then use most of our synchronous time together for interaction. But we want to know which videos are more engaging than others, which ones are difficult, which ones are not getting watched at all. So what I'm going to show is an example of some nice work done by Tame Sinha a few years ago. And what he did was he looked at all the data that you could collect from different videos, and there's different buttons you can click. So you can imagine, and this is the same as if you're on YouTube, you can click play, you can click seek forward, which is where you jump forward. You can scroll forward where you move the bar forward. You can make the rate play faster if you want to hear it more quickly. You can also seek backwards and scroll backwards. But by themselves, these are just low-level behaviors. However, you can start to aggregate them up in patterns. And so when a student is playing and then jumping forward and scrolling forward and rate fast, there's sort of a skipping phenomenon going on, which they associate with being disengaged. Whether it's because the material is hard or easy is a separate question, but it's a low level of information processing. On the other hand, if a student's playing the video, they're pausing it, and then they're going back and playing it again, then it looks like they're checking back. So that's sort of a higher level of engagement. And then you can look for other patterns where they're actually going back and rewatching things, or where they're actually clarifying an idea. And so based on this, you can take some really low-level data of what button someone clicks on when watching a video and start to move it up to something that might be meaningful to an instructor. Because what we don't want is getting so much data, well, okay, students skipped forward 62 times and skipped back 61 times. That's not something that's useful to me as an instructor to make decisions about. So that's just a little bit about what puts us forward to the data. Now I want to talk about the other, which is the more exciting side, which is how do we move from that to constructing analytics and then generating human insight. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through one example, somewhat in depth for you to sort of see all the richness that goes into creating analytics. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about a study we did that talks about how instructors use them. And then I'm going to try and just show you a whole variety of different analytics we've developed without the depth of how we got there, just so you can see a variety of the things that are possible, and most importantly, how they're useful, and how they get us to a point where we have to figure out how they're useful. So what I want to begin is by dispelling the common myth, and it's a language we hear a lot about data mining. If you think of mining as just going and picking up a whole heap of dirt and shaking it out for the golden nuggets, that's actually not what we're doing at all in learning analytics, because that is a very sort of rough-grained process. You don't know what you're looking for. You're just hoping you find stuff. In 2013, David Shaver said perhaps a more apt analogy is data geology. We're still going looking for things, but we have some underlying idea of the structure that lies beneath the surface, so we're going looking in a clever way. In my work, we're taking it a step further, and we think of it as engaging in data archaeology, because the thing that we're looking for, it isn't a thing, it isn't a nugget of gold or oil. It's actually trying to understand human behaviors of a past, or maybe it's, of course, an ongoing present civilization. And the point of this is that you never interpret what you find as artifacts by themselves. You're always using a lot of context to interpret them. So, for example, you might see the different structures here and say, well, we know that society was very religious, so we're going to look at different buildings that might have been temples. Or you can say, it looks like a society we knew something was very athletic, so we're going to look at their sports thing. The whole notion is that you're going in with a lens to look at something beyond just what's there, but to make meaning of what humans did in it and how those practices enhance them as a culture. So what does that mean in practice? It means we need theory. So theory, and depending on what kind of analytics you're developing, it will depend what kind of theory you need to use. It's going to tell you what variables to look for. It's going to tell you what different groups of people to pay attention to. And hopefully it's going to tell you how to take action. So this is the example I was referring to, and this is a project that actually started off as a research project and turned into an analytics project. And I think it's going to give you a nice snapshot of some of the ways that analytics come to be. So this is an example of some of my work on collaborative learning, and we were interested in online discussion. So before we ever got a hold of the data, we needed a model of what was important and meaningful in online discussion. For this work, we took a perspective from social constructivism that online discussions aren't just about sharing information, but it's a way for people to learn through conversation. It's for them to work out their ideas as they share them with others, and to be exposed to other people's ideas, and ideally to negotiate the differences. So in order for this to happen, there's really two parts to the process. One, they need to make posts and externalize their ideas, but they also need to hear other people's ideas and take those externalizations in. And so this is a notion of speaking and listening. And prior to this point, almost all of the research and the analytics, frankly, were just looking at what do people put into online discussions as if everybody was shouting into a vacuum. And so this work said if we're going to really understand how students engage, we need to also look how they engage with other people's comments. And this is something that can help an instructor understand what's going on in their course, but also for students, right? We tell students it's important to pay attention to what other people say, but they never had a way to know if they were doing it or how they were doing it. And they didn't know what other people were doing. And that was one of the biggest takeaways from this, just for students to see, oh, other students look at what other people are saying a whole lot more than I do. And it's kind of basic, but it was really a profound moment for some of the students. So based on that model, we developed a whole bunch of metrics. And I'm just going to focus on a couple at the top and point out what's special and important here is we didn't just count how many times they did something, because that's sort of the basic data that's getting collected most easily, but it often isn't useful to make decisions. So here what we said was, let's not just look at how many times they opened posts, but let's look at the percentage of the total posts that they looked at. And then let's actually put in a time threshold based on the length of the post and the percentage of them that they had some chance of possibly actually reading because they were there long enough. And what percentage of the ones they opened did they really spend a bunch of time on? And how often did they go back to a post, right? Discussions aren't necessarily hear something once and keep moving, but listen a couple of times. So once we had these metrics, we could build analytics on top of them. And this is not a technical talk. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the different things you can do with the same data. So with that same data, we could actually use a clustering algorithm to find people who are similar. We ended up finding 3 patterns of people. And not surprisingly, there were the people who didn't do too much at all. Those are the green circles. But then we had the people who, they looked at a few posts, but not the whole thing, but then they answered strategically. And then we had the people in orange who kind of did everything we ever dreamed. And so that told us, okay, well, we know there's one group that definitely needs some support, one group that's doing well, and one group we need to understand they're doing something different than what we expected, but it may or may not be a problematic thing. And another set of analyses we did was we built a prediction model. So how is it that the way students pay attention to other students' posts in online discussion relates to the posts they make themselves? This led us to some really important insights. For example, it turns out that if a student is going to make a post that refers back to their classmates, they almost always looked at those classmates' posts multiple times. And this makes sense from a process of I'm pulling different ideas together, I need to look at the posts, pull them together, and write my own post. But when we tell students to engage in a long discussion, we never told them to do that. So that was a really powerful finding. Another one, which not so surprising but good to know, is that the more students actually engage with posts versus just clicking through them to say I've seen it, led them to engage in richer argumentation. And it turns out, and this was quite unexpected, that they don't have to read everything deeply, but if they're going to only read a portion deeply, it's better if they look through things and figure out what to read. In other words, if you're going to read in a more concentrated way, be strategic about it by not just reading the first thing you come across, but figuring out what's worth reading. So all of this gave us guidance as to what we wanted to tell students to do. So we ended up building 2 different kinds of analytics. One were embedded listening analytics. And what we did here, this is actually the interface of the online discussion forum. And what we realized was if students are only going to read some posts, we want them to read posts that are connected, and we want them to see how they're connected. So we visualized that to support that behavior. And here that you can actually see the student was doing exactly that. The blue posts are ones they've read. The red ones are ones they haven't. You can see in the top right corner, they read sort of all of the first level replies to the synthesizing post, and then they chose not to engage with 2 of the threads. And so this is an example of what we think is strong listening behavior, where they only read some of the posts, but it looks like they were making strategic decisions about which ones to read. We also gave students their data explicitly and asked them to reflect on it so they could see both what they were doing compared to their classmates. And most important is that they were given this in a framework of what I've been explaining to you all along, which is telling students, we want you to engage in the discussions so that you can learn from each other. And you don't have to read everything everyone wrote, but if you're going to only read a portion, you should really check it all out first. And so the point is these weren't a series of decontextualized numbers. So they may look at that on the screen right now. They were part of a larger vision. The instructor communicated about what the discussion was about, what we're doing in this class, and then the numbers were brought in as a way to support it. So this gives students a reference frame to think about what the numbers mean and what to do about it. And what was really exciting was this had a big impact. And so in both of these graphs, students just engaged in the discussions in weeks 1 through 5, and we tracked the analytics in the background but didn't show them to the students. And then starting in week 6, students got access to the data of what they were doing and then the rest of the class as a group. And you can see, I think, pretty clear in these graphs 2 things. One, it made a difference. So in one case, a student was kind of looking over lots of things but not reading so much, and that changed. And then the other one, they just weren't reading much at all. And the second thing you can see is that it took a while to happen. It wasn't that week 6 suddenly was 100% perfect, but they got access to the data and things went up, things went down, but towards the end, we saw a positive change. And so I think that's an important lesson when we're thinking about analytics overall, is to recognize that it's going to take time. So data isn't magic, information isn't magic, but it's a powerful starting point to make decisions and change our behaviors. And at the bottom, you can just see, obviously, a very nice quote from one of the students that, they realized that they were doing something quite different. And instead of trying to game the system, they recognized the way the data tracks the system meant they need to do something different. So this is, I think, a really nice example of sort of a soup to nuts analytics project, where we sort of started with a theory, we figured out what data we could track, we did a whole bunch of investigations to figure out what behaviors were desirable, and then we created a system that showed the data back to students, though it could also be shown to instructors, to help them act on it. And the students were given a framework for action and asked to reflect on, each week they said, what does the data show you? What do you want to do different? And so I think that kind of gives a big picture of what I would say is sort of a best case analytics system. Of course, we don't always have time to go into all of that. And so what I want to show you now is something a little different, which is what happens when we're not privy to that process? What happens if you're an instructor and you're just given some analytics? So we did a study at NYU. We have a learning analytics dashboard that's available to all instructors for every course they teach. And we did a study the first semester it came out, which is about 3 or 4 years ago now. And we developed a model of how instructors use analytics. I'm going to describe a little bit of that for you now. And also we just, in the middle of everything this semester, conducted a follow-up study of how instructors are using the dashboard now. And so I'm just going to point out a lot of things are the same, but a few things that are different. So this is the model of teaching with analytics that we developed. And what I think is important to notice is 2 things. There's really sort of 2 halves to it. One is sense making. What am I trying to understand about my students? What does the data tell me? And importantly, I want to point out that this notion that I was saying of trying to contextualize findings, this notion of data archaeology, came through really, really strongly. Nobody looked at the dashboard, said, this information tells me everything I need to know, and went and did something. All of the processing of the information was done in the context of what an instructor knows about a class. And so I think what's really important to think about is that it's really a powerful combination of data and a deep understanding of the learning that leads to any sort of action. And that's the second part of the diagram, which is the pedagogical response. And that sort of shows us, okay, even though I know what's going on, figuring out what to do about it is really actually often a separate question, one which the data may not offer quite as much to us. So on the sense-making side of things, we saw a lot of times people don't have specific questions. They're just excited about the use of data. And they want to know if students are engaged, but they're not sure what that means or what the data will tell them. And we sort of see that sometimes that leads us to directly generate questions. And sometimes it lets us interact with the data, which then itself also leads us to generate questions. So what we found was a couple of things that are really important were sort of getting oriented and figuring out what the data said. And so when we did this study a few years ago, this was just a really important thing. All the instructors were new to working with analytics, and a lot of it was just sort of getting your head on straight and your feet on the ground. When we did the study this spring, and we'll be writing those findings up soon, we didn't see very much of this at all. Most people now, 3 years later, were quite comfortable with the analytics, and it was sort of like the fish that didn't see the water. This part of the process was really invisible. One part that has remained incredibly important, though, is finding reference points. So, you know, when you see that 20% of your students did something, is that good or bad? It really depends on your expectations. And so what we found was a lot of times we knew 0 was bad, 100 is good, but evaluating stuff in the middle wasn't very clear. So one of the things we're starting to work on is setting benchmarks for what would be a good result for this number before we get the data, so that when we get the data, we can understand what it means. As I mentioned, one of the most important things is how people make sense of the pattern. And so these are just some examples of how instructors took the data from the analytics system and compared it with what they knew. So it seemed like no one was doing anything online, but the class conversation was rich. What's going on here? Or the numbers were very low, but that's okay because apparently they instructed about these reading materials were kind of boring. And very importantly, making an attribution. If people are or not doing something, what does it do to? The students didn't read the things. Is it because the things were too hard? Are the students too busy? Or in this case, the instructor felt like it was their own fault for assigning too much. So this notion of attribution, when we say, okay, the pattern that we're seeing in the data isn't what we hope, try to figure out why is really what's going to lead us to the action. But there is one important other thing to bring in, which is learning analytics are often talked about very cognitively. We get the information, but it's often also very, very effective for students who see that they're not doing as well as they hope, or for instructors who see that things aren't going the way they imagined. It can be very hard, right? We're all putting hearts and souls and lots of energy into teaching and learning. So to find out that we weren't successful in what we achieved is actually something that can be hard. And for some people, it's motivating and saying, let me fix it. But for some people, it can be demotivating. And so that's one thing we're working on is how do we make sure that the analytics are cast in a light that helps people figure out how to move on and move up versus give up. So looking at pedagogical response, 3 years ago, we saw very little taking action. We saw a lot of people talking about how they might someday take action. And these are the 3 kinds of action they talked about. Whole class scaffolding, which sort of said, okay, it looks like a lot of students aren't doing something. I need to do something for the class as a whole. I need to go in and re-explain something. I need to give them a new activity. I need to give them a new resource. Another one was targeted scaffolding that might just say, oh, this helps me see students who need more help than others. I'm going to do something specific for them. And then sometimes it's say, okay, it turns out there's just a problem with the whole structure of the course. I need to fix that the next time I teach it. So we didn't actually see a lot of people do that 3 years ago. What we saw was mostly wait and see, where people said, those are the things I might do someday, but I just need to see how it goes. And what's interesting now, 3 years later, people are doing all those exact things. And so one piece of advice I would say is as you get started with analytics, it may take a whole cycle of teaching a course, having data available, not being ready to do anything about it. And I think that's okay. I think a lot of it is sort of getting a sense of what the data means in the context of a course. And that might take a whole course of looking at data, not doing anything quite yet, and getting ready to use it in the future. The other thing we saw that was very interesting is that sometimes the data will actually lead to bigger reflections on pedagogy. So for example, we looked at the assessment of participation, and this was looking at how often students participated online. And the instructor felt there was a real disparity with what they were seeing with the online engagement and what they were saying in class, and realized that maybe when they just used to grade engagement on how people participated in class, they were really missing something and students were engaging in other ways. So this led them to reconsider what does it mean to participate, how are they going to communicate to students about participating, and then how will they assess that. And again, 3 years ago, no one really checked much of the impact because they weren't doing a lot of things, but now we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing the cycle of, okay, the analytics are showing me to do something different, either for a few students or for all my students. I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to see what it tells me and if I've made that difference or if I need to try again. So what this sets up for us is sort of a cycle of using analytics. And now I'm looking really from an instructor and a designer perspective, where there's some question of something you want to know. And analytics always go better if there's something you want to know, as opposed to just saying, what's the data going to tell me? Because then the database answers have meaning, because there was something that you cared about in the first place. And hopefully then that leads to some sorts of educational action. So what I want to do for the last bit of the talk is just go through a whole bunch of short examples of different kinds of analytics that are available and the ways that we see them being used. So one question that was often asked in a flipped classroom and maybe asked also online is, are my students preparing? If they're coming to a synchronous session, whether on Zoom or face-to-face, but I've asked them to do stuff ahead of time, did they do it? So this is an example of one of the dashboards in the NYU instructional dashboard, and it's very, very simple. Down the left-hand side are names of students, not real students in this case, and across the top are different assignments and lessons. And if the student has accessed it, it shows up in light purple. If they've accessed it multiple times, it shows up in dark purple. So as an instructor, this can tell me a bunch of things. I can see the student in the first line is not looked at the course syllabus or the online facilitation guidelines or done their midterm participation blog entry. So that's a student I might really want to check in with. I can also look down the columns and say, oh, okay, well, everyone did the first blog entry, but they haven't done the second entry. And I can see for the blog entry, everyone went in, looked at it, did it right there. But for the Safari, which was a bigger assignment, they went in multiple times. In this case, that's quite obvious and as we would expect it to be. We talked to an instructor this semester who has a math course which has questions like this, and her goal is for students to look at the math questions, and they're not just little questions, they're sort of challenge questions they're supposed to ponder. They should think about them, reflect on them, work on them, and then come back and give their answer. So when she sees students have only accessed something once and put their answer in, that's not the pattern she's looking for. So in her case, seeing just the light purple would be problematic. And in fact, that was one of the things she saw. And so she started to tell students, if you're going to do well in these assignments, you need to look at the question, give yourself time to think, and come back and answer it. And I don't see that happening. So she had an idea of how students should engage with the assignment, and the data told her it wasn't happening, and so she was able to do something about it. Another thing you might ask are, when are my students preparing? And this is another screenshot from her dashboard. And without going too much into it, it shows that students are basically preparing the night before the class. Is that okay or is that a problem? It really depends what you're asking them to do and what your expectations are. But again, you've got this data. It gives you something about when the activity is happening, and it lets you think about, is that a good pattern? Is it a problematic pattern? If I want to change it, how am I going to restructure the course? How am I going to speak to the students, either individually or as a group, to let them know why I want them to do it differently? So one of the key things that we found is that the data tells you what's happening, but it doesn't really say why it's happening in terms of both why the students do it, but also what they think. And so one of the biggest things we found is that a lot of times we have expectations for how students will engage, especially with online resources, that they may or may not know and that aren't always communicated clearly, or even if they are communicated clearly, aren't received as such. So the data becomes this third object where you can sort of point out, I can see from the data the students who are only accessing the things the night before aren't doing as well on the weekly quizzes, for example. Another question is, are my students engaging? And this is just a heat map of the number of annotations that students made on a reading. So we have an online system where students go read and they can highlight little bits and put notes, and they're asked to do this. And the color code just shows how much they have done it. And so you can see patterns of students who are doing very little, students who are consistently doing a lot, the students in the third to bottom row who started off all right, did a ton, and then dropped right off. Each of these patterns might tell us something different. Again, the question of reference point is very important. We like to think that more is better, but if you want all your students to engage and collaboratively put notes in a document, if one student, particularly in this case the one on the bottom, is going in and putting in 25 comments, it might not leave room for the others. So it's an interesting question of whether you want to encourage everyone to do more, or whether maybe there's a middle point, or whether it's a range. And these are different questions for different courses, but it's really important because sometimes students don't understand how we think about these things. We could also ask who the students are engaging with. So one of my concerns when I run online discussions is that students are going to form little clusters with their friends and not talk to everyone else. So what you see here are just two prototypical social network diagrams, one in which everybody just talks to 2 or 3 people and one in which everybody talks to everybody. So it's harder to track this face-to-face, but in an online system, it's quite easy to see who talks to who. And so this is my actual class from a couple of years ago, and I was actually planning to do a very complicated thing that forced everybody to reply to 3 different people, and it turned out that wasn't necessary because they were actually replying to lots of different people, much more than I had realized. So this was a great way in which I had a question, are students really talking, diversely across the class? And I thought the answer was no, but the data showed me otherwise, and it saved me a whole lot of time and energy, in fact. How are my students engaging? This is an example from some MOOC work we did, and we were trying to understand, when do students ask rich questions about the content, and when are they asking when is the test, things that aren't getting deep into the learning. And what we found was there were certain linguistic cues that could help us find when they were talking really deeply. Things like can and does and why, as opposed to words that related to the exam. And based on this, we created a filter that let me as an instructor go in and just focus my attention on the deep, meaningful questions. And we could also create something that would highlight for a student when they're only asking courses that are sort of logistical and not digging into the material. Another interesting thing as an instructor is not just what students are doing, but what are we doing as instructors? So this is another example from a MOOC where there was 2 instructors and they acted quite differently. So Dr. Wang made responses at all levels of the discussion, did a lot of coaching, a lot of social presence, would say things like, that's correct, let's push a little further. Dr. Smith was very diligent as well, but sort of gave more straightforward answers that just answered whatever students had as a question. And what was interesting is these led to really different patterns in the social network diagram among students. And while the ones I show you, the real ones here, are quite complicated, I'm going to replace them with some a little more prototypical ones that hopefully show the pattern more clearly, which is that Dr. Wang's pattern of facilitating led students to talk to each other a lot more, whereas Dr. Smith created a pattern where students always asked him questions. So again, which is good or bad and what do you do about it depends on your model. Is a discussion supposed to be for students to help each other, or is it a place where you want them to ask you for the authoritative answer? Here we can just see the data lets us know what is happening. If it's what we want and how we want to change things is up to us. Couple final examples. Which of my students will need help is a very important one. Introductory calculus is a very challenging gateway course at NYU, and we wanted to know ahead of time which students are most likely to drop, fail, withdraw, or get a grade below C+, which might let them pass the course, but they're going to have challenges if they take a higher level math later on. So at the beginning of the semester, before anything starts, we actually had 4 variables we could put into a predictive model, and we were pleased to find that race and gender was not a predictor. Turns out high school GPA, sort of an overall ability measure, wasn't important either. What mattered was SAT math score and diagnostic tests, and that gave us a very strong predictor and ability to identify, even before the semester starts, who is likely to have trouble in this course. And what was powerful about this model is it wasn't just who, but it told us what the problem was. Both of these indicate weak algebra skills. We were also able to supplement that with data from the first couple of weeks of the course to get an even stronger model of who's going to have trouble. This sounds very exciting, but actually this project has been very challenging because even with all this information, how to effectively leverage it is really challenging. You don't want to tell students, well, based on a predictive model, it looks like you're not going to do very well in this course. You want to talk to them about how people who come in with similar preparation might need to do additional things to succeed. But that's a much softer message. And frankly, we've tried a whole bunch of different things to get students to engage in extra help, and there's not been as much uptake as we want. And so really right now, the building of the model, which was not simple, turns out to have been the easier part of the problem. And so we're working with different ways. How do we reach out to groups of students or individuals to offer them the support they need to succeed in this course? As you can see, I've been building up from sort of very straightforward, did they look at something online, to more complex examples. Here, last series of examples have to do with natural language processing, where we're actually using a whole bunch of computational linguistic methods to look at the words that students are saying. So this is some work we've done with students in the dental school, and we wanted to know how are they thinking about becoming a dentist. So there was a lot of preliminary work, but one of the strong findings that came out was that the importance of patience rises dramatically at the start of their 3rd year and stays strong until the end. So we were able to actually build up concept maps of how they talk about what it means to become a dentist. And I think you can see pretty clearly the transition through their program, the big change at the start of their 3rd year, and how the patient becomes so important. And what we found out was this changes almost dramatically at the start of year 3 when they start seeing patients. Not surprising, but there isn't as much structure and facilitation of that process as there could be. So now there's discussions about should they meet patients earlier on, or what can we do to support the process of recentering your thoughts around the patient, and what do we do for students who the patient doesn't rise in importance? And is it an ethical thing to look at that? Are all questions that we're dealing with on the practice side now that we know how to do the data analysis? In addition, on this slide, you'll notice the word professional shows up in orange, and that was another one we started to wonder about. And we wondered for the students, what does it mean to become a dental professional? So we looked at the literature, and a lot of the literature talks about sort of closing the gap from, this is what a professional is, this is me, how do I get closer? And we did see quite a bit of that in clusters of words they used together about collective identity. But we also saw something really interesting about personalizing the vision. And this has led us to a new model of professional identity that has to do with not just aligning yourself with the field, but figuring out your place in it. And now we're trying to think about how do we provide this to the advisor mentors to work with a student so that a student isn't just seen as trying to become this ideal perfect dentist, but gets to engage meaningfully with the questions of what kind of dentist do I want to be. Finally, we've looked at student reflections and developed a bunch of automatic classifiers. Students are reflecting all the time. Instructors haven't had time to look at these. So if we have an algorithm that can automatically tell us if the level of reflection is sort of generally low, medium, or high, that might help us know what to do. This graph, again, is moving across the 4 years, and what we can see is it starts off quite weak. The pink line is sort of students who aren't reflecting at all. And you see by the end of the first year, there's been a real shift where the people who aren't reflecting, the number's gone down, and people who are reflecting at a low level have gone up. But the thing we really want to see, the purple line, is people who are reflecting deeply. And what we see is just a really slow, gradual climb. Over time, that doesn't get that high in the end. So this is sort of suggests that maybe it's the start of D2, not the start of D1, where support for reflection would be most effective, because that's kind of the trigger point here. We can also look later in the program when students are asked to reflect if they don't pass one of their competency exams. And what we found is, again, using natural language processing, most of the students see the reason they didn't pass the exam as something they have the power to change. But there's a small percentage of the students who either see it as external to them, sort of the test was too hard, there's nothing I can do, and other students who see it as sort of some other reason, I ran out of time and there was a problem. And so those students who sort of see it as something they can't change are students we may want to work with more so that they're able to pass the exam moving forward. Finally, we might care about how different courses are related. So this is a matrix of the similarity between courses from a student's perspective for all 125 courses in our dental school. As you can see, it's quite overwhelming, even when you zoom in. And so this is a great example of a very sophisticated analysis we're able to do, but how do we act on it? So right now we're in the process of looking at if there's courses that students see as being very similar to other courses, why is that? Is it a good thing? Does it require restructuring? And this is part of a larger effort to try and simplify and condense the curriculum, because it's, as you can see, quite large. This is another example also of how context matters and how this gives us a starting point, but we need to dive in and not just see if the students see the courses similar, but how. They might just see them as similar because they're both very hard, or it could be because there's overlap in the material, which offers an opportunity for restructuring. So I'll just end with a couple of thoughts. That's a lot, I know. There's so many possibilities. I think the big takeaways, though, are there's lots of things we can do with the data, but how do we get better data? And how do we know what to do with it that's going to really be meaningful and impact teaching and learning in a positive way? And then we can take a step up to the higher level, and how is this going to change our relationship with students and their relationships to learning? How can the data inform without dictating our decisions? How can we make decisions to generate better data? And what dangers do we need to watch out for? There's a lot that's been written on issues of data ownership, consent and choice, transparency and accountability, privacy and surveillance. Particularly at this moment, we need to think about issues of algorithmic bias and fairness, and how do we use algorithms to help promote equity rather than simple equality. And we need to think also about the creation of new labels. Lots of predictive models can produce a label of an at-risk student, but what happens when you put that label on students? How do they get to have control over that label, and when does it change? So in an effort to deal with all this, Learning Analytics at NYU is a collaborative effort that we really are trying to put people, not data first, and use data in service of our educational mission. There's a lot of partnerships between Learn, between our IT team, faculty, administrators, students. I didn't focus on it today, but we're doing a lot of user-centered design. So we're trying to roll out a student-facing learning analytics tool, and we've been working with small groups of students in design sessions to help them figure out what do they want help with, what data would be useful, and how do we create that. So instead of creating analytics for, we're trying to create analytics with. We're also dealing with scalability to serve a large university with 10+ global campuses, diverse international student body, many of whom are going to be international, at least for the next semester. And at the same time, use our research to innovate and build a knowledge base. So we're not just doing for now, but trying to understand how do we build towards better analytics on the whole. And lastly, I wanted to share is that this is part of an ongoing community conversation. So it's not just that we're doing analytics, but we're continually getting different groups together to ask important questions about what our shared vision for learning analytics is at NYU. And it may be different at Minnesota, it may be different in your K-12 district, but trying to understand how analytics should play a role in students' learning, instructors' teaching, what information do we want to provide, what do we want people to be able to do with it, are all important things to engage with. So I'll just close by thanking and mentioning this is obviously not work I've done on my own. This is our core Learn team that involves faculty, postdocs, staff, and students. We have amazing partners in NYU IT who we work with constantly, and many more people across NYU in instructional technology, in design, in faculty roles, who work with us on a diverse set of projects. I think I'll stop there, say thank you very much, and see if maybe we have some questions.
Let's give Alyssa a virtual, I don't know how that works, a virtual applause. But thank you so much, Alyssa, for sharing the work you're doing at NYU. We have around 4 to 5 minutes for the Q&A. And so, Shank, do you want to help us moderate this part?
Sure. Well, I have some questions that have come in on the chat. Maybe I'll just lead with one of those. And will folks be able to actually grab a hold of their microphones and ask questions after that? Hold on.
Yes, if you want to ask a question, you're using your voice, you can raise your hand. I will keep track of who raised the hand first to allow you to talk. But let's get started with the question that was sent in earlier.
Okay, so Emily Belcher, and I'll just go ahead and raise it for you, Emily. I'm sure you'd be happy to do it yourself. Asked, so it seems like your work is grounded in pedagogy, so education with youth through undergrads. What's different when you use learning analytics in educating adults, for example, in informal education settings or community education settings?
Okay, so I think I would maybe separate that question. I like to think of university students as adults, or at least adults in training. But I think one of the big differences in informal and community education is sort of the power relationship. And so one of the things we talk a lot about, in higher ed, there's a distinct power relationship that instructors and administrators have over students, whereas in informal and community education, it's often driven from the bottom up. So while I still think in higher ed, we want to give a lot of control and power to students, I think in informal and community education, that's even more so, right? And so then you want to think about it's how do you give power to the people, both individually and collectively, who are engaging in those experiences? I think another challenge is that you have a lot more systems to deal with. So at the university, we have a limited number of tools that we use that we create data from. In fact, our Learning Analytics dashboard integrates data from 26 different systems, which is a lot as it is. But when you're starting to go to informal and community situations, you often have engagement taking place across platforms. So I just think of some of the groups I'm involved with where there's an email chain, a WhatsApp group, sometimes we Slack, and sometimes people are doing things on Facebook and Instagram. So suddenly you've got the same people engaging in a whole bunch of different interactions across spaces. And then you have to start to think about, are we integrating that data or are we keeping it separate, and what do we care about? But I think for any analytic situation, you really want to start out with what is our goal. So in community situations, are you trying to track the group's knowledge or its interactions? Data may be unlimited, but our ability to work with it effectively is not. So I think starting off and prioritizing what's most important to us, because what we have information on drives what we do, right? It's a constant thing in education. Whatever we assess is what we focus on. So I think that's going to be true with what we metric as well. And there's a great phrase, I forget who put it out there first, but we are what we measure. And I think that's just good words to go by in any situation.
Okay, and another question from the chat was from Maxwell Kramer. He said, I love the idea of using analytics to guide a course in real time. How can we scale that down to small class sizes? I'm worrying about over-interpreting small samples and student privacy and sharing data.
So in some ways, I actually think the power of data in small classes is actually quite large. Because those classes are already more interactive, and so there's more going on to collect data on than some of the large ones. I think one of the important things in small classes is the way you don't over-interpret data is that the data is one piece of maybe it's not exactly three-legged, many-legged triangle. Whereas an instructor, there's things you know, at least back in the day, there's things that you also knew about students from interacting with them face-to-face, and the notion is we're adding information, we're not substituting it. So one powerful thing for me when I've used analytics is, especially teaching lots of international students, there's students who seem very quiet in the face-to-face classroom, and some of them are very active and engaged online. Some of them are very active but not super engaged online, and some are neither of the above. And I can't tell the difference without that data. So that's a case in which the data disambiguates sort of what's going on under the surface. But the other thing is I think the data, for me at least, and especially in a small class, is a starting point often for conversation. So for example, data shows a student not doing well or not being very active. You know, the answer isn't sort of to come down on them. I think the answer is to use it as a starting point and say, you know, the data is showing me that you're doing something that's not the same as everyone else in the class. You know, let's talk about that. There's other ways to start that conversation. I think there's been a past sort of a dirty secret. We don't want people to know we have data on them, but I think in fact you can go the opposite way and say, you know, here's the data I'm seeing. Can you help me understand that? And that's something that's a lot easier to do in a small class than a large one where you're trying to reach out to lots of people.
Thanks. Several other questions have come in. Maybe I'll just take one more because we're already 11 o'clock. People are hanging around, so they must have really enjoyed the talk. So this is from Allison Link. There's a lot of variance in the ways instructors implement technologies for teaching, which makes learning analytics data quite messy. What kinds of techniques have you used or had to develop to make your learning analytics tools and analyses generalize across courses that are taught very differently?
I think there's three answers to that question after acknowledging, yes, that's very hard and a big problem. One is, one of the ways to make your analytics generalized is to make them more general, which frankly makes them a little bit less useful. So like that first analytic I showed that's just how many times did a student access something, that's not the most exciting analytic, but guess what? It works across every class. And then that leaves the role of what did accessing it mean to the instructor. So sort of thinking about the division of responsibility between how much can I do in the data processing to give it meaning as an analyst to produce the analytics versus how much I'm leaving to the instructor. Even in that one, it just shows did they access it once or many times. That's a simplification that was done on purpose because when you start to show the number of times, it becomes very complicated, but it has limitations. So, you know, one way you make them work across lots of classes is you make them more general, which makes them sort of less useful and leaves more to the instructor, but then allows for value because then these are going to be rolled out to, you know, thousands of instructors. So that's one of the things to do. Sorry, can you repeat? There was another part to the question that I'm getting now.
Yeah, you promised us three answers.
I know. I got to remember what the other two were.
Yeah, it ends with, what kinds of techniques have you used or had to develop to make your learning analytics tools and analyses generalize across courses that are taught very differently?
Yes. The other thing is it's not just you generalizing the tools, it's the instructors understanding how the analytics are developed and acting in response. So one of the big findings that we've found through our conversations with instructors about using the analytics is a lot of times you teach your course once with the design you have, and you get the analytics, and the data doesn't tell you what you want. So it's a silly thing, but the system only tracks links that are accessed in one way and not the other, and it's the way most people do things, but not everyone. So I had half my links in right and half my links in wrong, which when you're teaching normally doesn't matter. So the first time I taught the class, it looked like nobody looked at half of my stuff, which wasn't true, it just wasn't getting tracked. So I fixed it for the next time. And honestly, I think part of it is, what we found is that one of the big findings is instructors say, I need to really think about the design of my course, not just with respect to pedagogy, but also with respect to data. Now that I understand how the data is generated, and it shows if someone looks at something, I might separate these two things that I had put together because I really cared about knowing about them separately. So I guess I would say part of it is on the analytics and part of it is on the instructors. And then the third answer is communicating that. So it's helping instructors not only understand the data, but how it's generated, because it's the interaction between the two that really matters.
And I'll just add that Joe Constant raised a question. He basically anticipated some of what you just said and said, it sounds like we need sort of flow charts for how an instructor learns how to use analytics, maybe in an iterative way, learns about the kinds of questions that they care about answering, and maybe goes back and sees there are different variables to track or not. So it sounds like you guys are on the same page.
That's what we're hoping comes out of the current study. The one we did 3 years ago, we couldn't talk about how people learn to use analytics because they were still just figuring it out. But That's what we're hoping is going to come out of the data we collected this spring, is the cycle of people. We asked them to reflect the last 3 years, how their use of analytics changed and how they learned. And I will say, for what it's worth, it's more high touch, but everyone said, you provided us with lots of resources, thanks, but that's not really what mattered. What mattered was having another human there to help me work through it. And it has happened every single interview that we've done, which should just be us finding out about the analytics, has turned into some sort of joint interpretation because you've got another person there. And so having experience, in our side, it's the instructional technologists who are on the analytics team who can sort of sit shoulder to shoulder with someone matters a lot. And then having other instructors who care about the same things as you to talk about it with. So, you know, as I mentioned, even if the data shows me which students are struggling, even if I know why they're struggling, that doesn't always mean it's a simple thing to fix. And so sort of having this notion of both analytical and pedagogical coaching, and, you know, our analytics team is very pedagogically aware. I feel very, very lucky that our IT people care so much about pedagogy, and I think that's been really, really important.
Bodong, do you have any last words? I think we're done.
Is that for Alyssa or for me?
For you, Bodong, I think we're at the end of time.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to really thank again, Alyssa, for this wonderful talk. I really appreciate all the wisdom you shared with us and the breadth and the human-centeredness of your approach, your focus on pedagogy and so on. I just want to concur with a lot of comments left in the chat. Also saying thank you and say it's so inspiring to listen to your presentation, and I will follow up with you later on about how to share additional resources and pointers for our audience to go to if they want to learn details about your studies. With that, thank you again, Alyssa, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alyssa.
All right.